You know, this is kind of crazy because he said the roots of the Holocaust lay in the Spanish Inquisition. I said, come on, 500 years back, totally different environment, totally different kind of circumstances. But the more I studied it, the more I see that actually Dr. Hilberg was quite prescient in his analysis, as I will show you shortly. Perhaps the most significant thing is the fact that, like the Nazis, the Spanish Christians were slaves to their ideology. And they had certain very fixed notions that they simply could not find a modus vivendi to get past the social implications. For example, let's go jump for a second to the 19th century. This is a picture of young Edgardo Mortara. He is going to be the subject of a Steven Spielberg movie. I think it's coming out this year or next year. In 1850, he was a young boy, about 6 years old, if I remember correctly, in a Jewish family in Bologna, Italy. And they had a Christian nanny, a Christian maid working in the home. When Edgardo was a little baby, he had a fever. And the very pious and loving, illiterate maid felt terrible that because he was Jewish, and because he was probably going to die of this fever, like, unfortunately, you know, infant mortality in the 19th century was pretty high, she wanted to have him baptized so he would not burn in hell forever. So she secretly took him to the priest and had him baptized as a Christian, and then he got better. And she didn't tell anybody about it. A few years later, she is speaking with one of her friends in the market, and she mentioned to a friend, by the way, you know, I had little Edgardo baptized. He's actually a Christian. Don't tell anybody. She went immediately to the Vatican police. And the Vatican police, as you see in this Hirschberg representation, the Vatican police went and they arrested this, I think he was 13 years old. They arrested a 13-year-old boy and stole him away from his parents. We're talking about the 1850s. This is a comparatively modern period. There was a huge hue and cry. Even in America, we had protests here in New York City over this egregious act that the Pope would actually kidnap a Jewish child over this crazy fact that he had a little water sprinkled on him unwillingly when he was a baby. But the Pope held firm. The great Moses Montefiore used all of his wealth trying to take this child away from the church, and he was unsuccessful. In the end, the child was raised in a monastery. He ended up, as you see him here on the right, he was eventually reunited with his mother and his brother, as you can see, but he lived his life out as a Christian priest, preaching specifically to Jews and trying to convince them to convert to Christianity. It's a terribly tragic story that this one child was lost to the Jewish people as a result of this ideology that once a person is baptized, they may not revert to Judaism whatsoever. This is exactly what happened in Spain. You basically have, in the 1390s, there was a wave of riots directed against Jews, primarily from social and political and economic reasons. But the wave of riots was surging across the peninsula, and the lower clergy insisted on having all of these Jews forcibly baptized. Possibly as many as 100,000 Jews were forcibly baptized against their will. They were coerced. They were not, agreeing to this. But the church, nevertheless, said, well, you speaking to the lower clergy who are frequently illiterate and unaware of canon law, you're not supposed to do that. We've agreed already since the 4th century, St. Augustine, Pope Gregory, we're not allowed to baptize Jews against their will. But once they're baptized, that's it, they're Christian. And so this created a massive class of people living in Spain who were still fully personally identifying with the Jewish community, still going to their regular shuls, still buying at the kosher butcher, still going and learning Torah with the rabbi, and yet they were nominally Christians, completely free from all of the legal disabilities that Jews otherwise suffered under. They were free to attend university, free to travel the entire region of Spain, free to engage in whatever trade they wanted to pursue. Then all of a sudden, within 50 years, they found themselves in leading positions of all sectors of the Spanish economy, culture, media, even the church, because they were like Jews with nothing holding them back, no legal restrictions. They were still marrying into Jewish families, still marrying other nominal Christians. And the church realized by the middle of the 15th century, they have a serious social problem on their hands. They called these Jews new Christians to distinguish them from old Christians who were not forcibly baptized. And by the way, we're talking about generations here, 3, 4, 5 generations of people who are behaving like this. Or they also call them conversos, meaning those who converted, again, unwillingly. Crypto-Jews, meaning hidden Jews. And the derogatory term marrano, which means swine. It's not the preferable term, obviously. And so by the end of the 15th century, Ferdinand and Isabella, who have effected a dynastic linkage that brought together most of Spanish territory, they brought in this man, Thomas de Torquemada, who himself actually had some converso background in his family history. And they said, we want you to put a stop to this. So this was the onset of the Spanish Inquisition, which was not directed at Jews per se. It was not directed at those Jews who were never forcibly converted. It was directed at those Jews who were converted to Christianity, but were not behaving as Christians. They were still practicing Jewish rites. And so Torquemada instituted a wide-ranging purge of Spanish society that turned it literally upside down, with the cycle of sudden arrests, torture, forced confessions extracted, naming names, going to do more forced arrests, and of course then ending in the humiliation of the people accused. Here you see Goya's famous Inquisition painting that shows the Jews in the San Benito, these humiliating garb that they were forced to wear, not only at the trial, but if they were found guilty yet allowed to live, they would frequently be required to wear this for the rest of their life. And after their death, the San Benito would then be placed on the wall of the church. So it would be a reminder to all people that a particular family had this taint in their background. They're also required to wear these ridiculous conical hats that later were changed into American culture as dunce caps, associated with, badly behaved children or stupid children. And of course the witch's cap as well. There's a lot to say about the Inquisition. I don't want to take us too far afield, but you should recall that there was a strong economic motive in the Inquisition. There's a lot of discussion whether this was primarily a religious phenomenon, kind of a fanaticism, or whether it was really an economic means to acquire the property of those who were accused of Judaizing, because if you betrayed your neighbor and your neighbor was found guilty, then you got a share of your neighbor's property. So there was an incentive to rat out people and then to receive some of the property. Of course, then you could be ratted out just as easily by someone else. But it literally turned the society upside down. Until finally, Ferdinand explaining to Isabella and Torquemada explained to Ferdinand and Isabella, shown here in this picture, that the reason why he's not successful in extirpating these secret Jews is that the real Jews, or at least the non-converted Jews, are still in Spain. And they are like a gravitational center for the crypto-Jews, because they can always go back and be educated by the rabbi and learn Hebrew and get kosher food and learn about Shabbat and things like that. So Ferdinand said the only way we're going to stop this problem is if we get rid of all the non-converted Jews, hence the expulsion of 1492 that removed all Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. This had obviously a massive impact on the Sephardic psyche. And let us recall that the Inquisition began in, let's say, 1478, but the forced conversions began in 1390. So we're talking about a whole century of Jews living under these circumstances. And when the end came, and when Jews were removed from the peninsula forcibly, it created an indelible impact that was felt around the world. The Spanish expulsion, Gerushval, was understood in its time the way we understand the Holocaust today. And by the way, in terms of the spacing, we are living after the 20th century Holocaust, with roughly the same amount of time that many of the 15th century thinkers that I'll talk about lived after the Gerush Sfarad. Here's, for example, the famous Ferrara Bible that was printed by Sephardic refugees in Italy, and you can see the kind of imagery on it of the ship at sea with the broken mast and the storm winds and the sea monsters, this is on the cover of a Bible, trying to portray the tremendous tribulations that they experienced as they were sailing through the dangerous Mediterranean. The fantastic composition in Portuguese, hardly ever studied today, but really a work of tremendous genius by Samuel Usque, a man who wrote the poetic account of the suffering of the Jews to explain the ultimate consolation with the redemption of Messiah. And perhaps most tragically, one figure that I'd like to pause on for a second, the very, very sad story of Uriel da Costa, who was a Portuguese Jew who rediscovered his Jewish identity as a teenager. He was raised in Portugal as a Christian, and when his mother finally found a way for them to leave the country, we should recall that the Inquisition lasted until the 19th century, and it would follow Jews from country to country. There was no way to really escape the Inquisition. There were 25 Jews, for example, almost a century later, who were doing business on the Aegean Sea, the Adriatic Sea on the coast of Italy, and the Pope discovered that there's a small community of crypto Jews living all the way over there. He had them arrested and burned at the stake in 1556. Amazing. You could not get away from the Inquisition. Anyways, his mother tells him, he was about 15 years old, Uriel, I've got to tell you, you're actually Jewish. You know, typically, people would not tell their children they're Jewish when they're children because they're worried that they would go and tell other people on the playground. So people didn't learn that they were actually Jewish until they were adults. In some cases, absolutely amazing cases, women were the mainstay of the perpetration of Jewish identity in the crypto-Jewish community. And women would do all kinds of things to force themselves not to lose their Jewish identity. And one of the most chilling accounts that I read in some of the Inquisition trials, because we know about these people because they were found, caught, and we have records of how the church treated them. There were women who had a pact that if they could not circumcise their sons, they would perform a small ritual scarification on their shoulder, like a little circle that they would actually dig out of the flesh on their shoulder, make a permanent scar there to remind them that they have the obligation to circumcise their sons as soon as they have that possibility. I mean, this is also something that doesn't happen in Brooklyn today. It shows a tremendous amount of dedication, incredible dedication to Judaism. Anyways, Uriel da Costa finds out he's Jewish. He says, wow, I always knew there was something special about me. I'm so excited. I can't wait to learn more. She says, listen, the reason I'm telling you now is because I managed to get us a way to get out of Portugal to Amsterdam. It is a very liberal city, a lot of freedom, of mores and things like that. Nowadays, of course, this is no longer true of Amsterdam. It's a very, rigid city. That's a joke. You stay awake, but okay. Anyways, and he says, great, I'm finally going to learn about Judaism. He goes to Amsterdam, he's studying Judaism, studying all these texts and stuff like that. And he's a smart young man, but he starts going to shul, and he starts saying to people, wait a second, isn't what you're saying Lashon Hara? And wait a second, are you allowed to do that on the Holy Shabbat? And he starts being kind of like a pain in the side of the indigenous Jewish community there, because he's reading the Torah, and he's saying, it says right here, you're not supposed to do this, and everyone, including the rabbi, is getting really difficult. He writes a book in which he lists all the things that he says the Jewish community are not living up to the standards that they want. He's kind of like the ultimate Baal Tshuva, And he says, wait a minute, aren't we going to sing 25 Smirot? You want to go to sleep, and he wants to go through the venture, But this is what he's like, and so they put him in Cherem once, twice, 3 times. They banish him from the city. They say, you can't be here, it's terrible. And every time he comes back, he begs forgiveness, but then he starts up again. Tragically, the 3rd time, the Council of Elders say, look, we've already put you in Cherem 3 times. If you want to come back this time, to make sure that you're really serious, we need you to lie down at the entrance of the synagogue, and every single member of the shul is going to walk over your prone body into the shul. And that's a humiliation that you have to endure to recall that you're supposed to maintain your place. He accepts it. He undergoes this horrible ritual. He goes home. He writes an 11-page suicide note, and he kills himself. And that 11-page suicide note, which is written in Latin, it's under the title, "The Example of a Human Life," is one of the most chilling documents about the impact of the Inquisition on these Jews. Because he was someone who had so much motivation, so much love for Yiddishkeit, so much love with Torah, but he could not find a way to put himself back into the Jewish community with all of its faults. And that's also a casualty of the Inquisition. This particular picture here shows him, it's an imaginative one. These two figures would not have met in real life. But this is Acosta here. You see him in a very severe kind of black garb with a serious mien and very determined gaze. And sitting on his lap is a representation of the young Baruch Spinoza, who also in Amsterdam had a similar kind of experience. So the artist Shmuel Hirschbaum was trying to say that, that Spinoza learned from Acosta, that he learned at his knee, and of course this all just go back to the impact of the Spanish Inquisition. So I'd like to tender for your consideration that this has an impact on the Sephardic identity as well. The difficulty of existing in two worlds, the secular and the religious, can sometimes produce some very untoward results and can create a kind of cognitive dissonance that is sometimes quite fatal. Did I see your hand up? Or?
Yeah, I just want to know, is there any truth to Christopher Columbus saving Jewish people?
Yes. He definitely, Christopher Columbus had a great affinity for the Jewish people. He knew how to write in Hebrew. There are persistent rumors that he himself was Jewish, although it's unlikely. But he definitely had conversos aboard his ship. He employed travelers. He employed navigators who were Jewish. And he frequently liked to pepper his letters to his son with Hebrew phrases. Okay, so let's go to the penultimate period here. The Sephardic diaspora. And here's a map that shows you how the Sephardim coped with the immediate pressure of the expulsion. You can see there are Jews moving their way through most of them went immediately into Portugal, but this was a very short-lived haven. They only had 5 years there, and they were then forcibly converted in 1497, for reasons which are more complicated than we have time for. They spread throughout the Mediterranean basin. Many of them found refuge in Muslim lands. The Ottoman Sultan said, please, he openly spoke, he openly wrote to the King and Queen of Spain saying, please, send me as many Jews as you can. I love Jews. They're so fantastic for the economy. Bring them over here to Constantinople. And they came. Many of them went up across the Pyrenees into North Africa, into Europe, and then many of them went all the way out to the Americas, where we have them in South America in particular. And ironically, we're all sitting here today, of course, because of the Spanish expulsion. Because a certain number of Portuguese Jews, these are Jews who went to Portugal, were converted to Christianity, and were living as crypto-Jews. They made their way to South America, and they lived in a little island called Recife, and this was under Portuguese control. At a certain point in time, the Dutch took over Recife, 1654 if I remember correctly, and the Portuguese crypto-Jews said hooray, and they all came out of the closet, so to speak. And they all said, surprise, we're all Jews. And that was great. They were having Purim celebrations, and then I think it was the Spanish came back. And they took over the island, and the Inquisition was slammed right back onto them, and so they had to flee. And they said, we got to go someplace Protestant instead of Catholic. And they ended up, of course, in New Amsterdam, right here, New York City. So we owe our existence as Jews in America to a small ragtag group of Portuguese crypto-Jews, Sephardim, who made it through Recife. And it was during this period, I think, if we talk about the formation of a Sephardic identity, that we begin to get this tremendous international solidarity of Sephardim that you do not see with Ashkenazim in the same way. And I'd like to pose a couple of possible markers for that. One is the early influence of Doña Gracia Mendez, who was without doubt the most powerful Jewish woman, perhaps even the most powerful woman of the 16th century. This is not what she looked like, but I found this picture and I thought it had enough attitude to really represent her. We don't actually have a picture of her. We do have a medallion. I didn't bring it to show you here, but we do have a medallion that was struck of her niece. So we can kind of guess what she looks like, but not really. This is more fun for us. At any rate, she was a Portuguese Jew who was, again, forcibly converted to Christianity. As soon as she got out of there, went to Constantinople, she said, I'm a Jew and I don't care what you say. And she actually challenged the Pope. She tried to organize an international boycott of a particular port, the one I mentioned earlier, Ancona, because they had persecuted Portuguese Jews. And she actually got a tremendous amount of support from other Jewish maritime merchants. However, she was opposed by this woman, Benvenida Abravanel. This is not actually her picture. This is a picture of her student, Eleonora of Toledo. I still like the picture, and it's very common actually that teachers are often associated with their students, and you see their students, you think of the teachers. Like here's a couple of my students, for example. A lot of people see me on the street and they say, wait a second, aren't you Will Smith? They say, Will Smith, is that you? Right, so Benvenida Abravanel, the niece of the great Don Yitzhak Abravanel, also known as the Abarbanel, opposed the boycott that Doña Gracia set up because she felt that it would have a negative impact on Jews elsewhere in papal lands, and it ultimately ended up not to work out. But you have people like the Chida, a very important Sephardic rabbi, who in the 18th century launched a massive, probably the first of its kind, a massive, literally tzedakah collecting expedition throughout Europe, where he found scattered Sephardic communities, and whenever there was an Ashkenazic and a Sephardic community in a particular town, he tended to be shunned by the Ashkenazim, who said, hey, we've already given, but there's a Sephardic shul down the street. And then he found those little isolated Sephardic towns. He happened to be not your typical tzedakah collector. He was a person of phenomenal international importance as a scholar. And the fact that a man like the Chida would make his way around Europe served in a very important way to unify these scattered Sephardic communities who began to feel more like they were one single body. Very important. I can't minimize his impact, and scholarship is beginning to realize his role in that. So let me conclude by bringing us to the 20th century in particular, and we really have to concentrate on the efforts of this man in particular, HaChacham Ovadia Yosef, Rishon LeZion, the chief rabbi of Israel. And the reason why he is so significant in this last stage of Sephardic identity building is primarily because, let's return to the question we started with, right? How is it that 500 years later, Sephardim still identify as Sephardim? And we can make it just a little bit more complicated, because how many of those Sephardim can actually trace their family back to Spain? Maybe Portugal, but Spain. Most Sephardim associate with some kind of subset of their diaspora. North African, Moroccan, let's say, or Tunisian, Syrian, of course, very important subset of it. And what could have happened to the various small pockets of Sephardim is they could have, balkanized or atomized into their own specific sub-identities without keeping that kind of international cohesion that people like the Chida had really promoted. And this was especially true in Israel when the Rishon LeZion, HaChacham Ovadia Yosef, was active, and he defined early on two things. The first of all, he was a scholar of phenomenal stature, a person with a photographic memory. I mean, by all accounts, he had an amazing grasp of rabbinic literature that it's hard to quantify. Especially, by the way, when I talk to my students today, students don't appreciate what that kind of intellectual strength was, because we have everything on our phones now. And so we've sort of lost the understanding of what it means to amass so much information. My students tend to confuse information gathering with wisdom. They're very, very different things. They're related, But many people can gather a tremendous amount of information without gaining a drop of wisdom. And others have very little information to deal with, but their wisdom is as deep as the sea. At any rate, Ovadia Yosef said two things. The first is, because of his tremendous scholarship and his stature as a scholar, he was able to raise the flag of Sephardim against the dominant Ashkenazi message that was prominent in Israel and in Israel Talmudic scholarship. And he aggressively permitted Sephardic leniencies and also enhanced Sephardic stringencies in contradistinction to the Ashkenazi. And second, perhaps even more importantly, is he gave us a working definition of what is a Sephardi. It was a very broad definition, but a very simple definition that people could latch onto and say, yes, that's me. Even though my father's from Syria, my mother's from Morocco, maybe there's even a Frank in there somewhere, people could say, yes, I am Sephardi, because he said the definition of Sephardi is anyone who follows Maran Beit Yosef. If you follow the Shulchan Aruch, if that is your prime halachic guide, you are Sephardi. As opposed to Ashkenazim, who are Holchim Biyad Ramah, that we follow Rabbi Moshe Isserles on top of the Shulchan Aruch, then you're excluded. You can respect the Shulchan Aruch, but you're not necessarily Sephardi. You can be a token Sephardi, maybe, closeted Sephardi. But the real Sephardim are anyone who follows the teachings of the Beit Yosef. And that allowed many Jews to really identify themselves clearly in that sense and create a cohesive Sephardic identity that, of course, had phenomenal political power in Israel as well, more than we have time for. So, in conclusion, I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about my thoughts on the major points of development of the Sephardic identity. I think we are entering a period here in America, as Mr. Rudy and I were talking about earlier, that we have such phenomenal freedom and such phenomenal opportunity that if we do not squander these possibilities, perhaps we will even have a new period in Israel, maybe here in Brooklyn even, of creating that Sephardic ideal of the Maimonidean type who exemplify excellence both in the secular world and in the Torah world. Thank you very much for your endurance. I have time for questions.
Yeah, you didn't mention. You didn't mention the role of Ashkenazi rejection as part of development of the Sephardic identity, but it's the elephant in the room in some respects. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, it's definitely very significant. With the pendulum of history, there are always going to be groups that have the upper hand culturally and so on. And one of the unfortunate implications of the expulsion was that the bulk of Sephardic Jewry found themselves in Muslim lands, right? North Africa, the Ottoman Empire. And the Muslim lands in general were left behind in the Industrial Revolution. So all of the cultural and technological achievements that you see happening in places like England and France and in America as well, all the Jews living in Sephardic lands or in Muslim lands were behind them by a good 100 years. And so when you combine that with the growth of Jewish nationalism in the form of Zionism and the establishment of the state, and the general disdain of 19th and early 20th century Zionism for religious Jewry, then the Sephardim tend to be very low on the totem pole, and they are the subject of Ashkenazi disdain in general. Ovadia Yosef represents that resurgence in Israel when Sephardim begin to get their footing generationally and economically as well. And in the